حلو ايه ده؟ حالك اهلا وسهلا. رسالة منصف بن سعيد معالي الوزير الأستاذة إليزابيث زكريا سيد ابني. معالي الوزير روني عريشي.
Pleasure to meet you, yes. Your foundation? I'm 80 years old. No, I'm 80 years old. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Tell that to my wife.
Thank you. Because she's French.
She's French, Armenian. French, we're both Armenian. Alabiya.
كمان من حلب.
كمان من حلب.
أهلا وسهلا. Welcome, welcome.
C'est le mari de Chéri.
I think he will be having, I don't know, French or...
Thank you. Good to see you. It's a pleasure.
His Excellency, and this is of Lebanon. Wajdi Shibli Wajdi Mallah. He has all compounds. It's difficult. He used to be very close friend of Afiq Habibi, and he taught me law.
Pourquoi les femmes sont
He is the one who will introduce you.
Oh, yes.
He is the professor of political science. En général,
Les militaires sont toujours soumis aux civils.
retired general.
ناصر الخليل
Let's hope your meeting is better now.
I don't know.
Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased and honored to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Edward Djerejian. I think that many Lebanese know about him, at least, as long as he has been an important actor of the US policy in the Middle East. And I think that nowadays he is at the head of the James Baker III Institute for Political Research. And he has a very important experience in the US policy. I should say the US policies in the Middle East. We are very happy to welcome each and everyone here. It's a very small place. We have tried to preserve it, as it was very difficult to preserve the old houses in Ashrafi. As you know, that everything has been under speculation. And, well, it's a small place, but I think that the quality of our visitors, our friends here, is very, very important. I have tried to introduce everyone,
Thank you.
I have tried to invite Mrs. Ola Yaqoubian because she is a prominent Armenian MP, but I think she has something urgent to do at the parliament. So please, she said, please excuse her. She may find another opportunity to meet with you. Mr. Richard Koyumidjian, who is acting Armenian Minister of Social Affairs, had to also to excuse himself because he has to participate at the Council of Ministers. It's going to be held now at 11 o'clock. So the only Armenian prominent figure we have up here is His Excellency Mr. Djerejian. And it would have been, I think, a very good opportunity to say a word about the Armenian genocide, because yesterday there has been a long and powerful march from Burj Hamoud to Anteliès to remind everybody that a genocide, a real genocide, should have been recognized by the Turkish. So I think that I have made my homework concerning the Armenians. Now we have to tackle the issues about the US policies in the Middle East, and I thank very much Mr. Imad Salami, who is an important professor of political science at the LAU, Lebanese American University, and he'll be introducing you, Excellency. But let me tell you something about Mr. Salami. Mr. Imad Salami has published already at least 3 important books about political science in the Middle East. And the latest was The Decline of Nation States After the Arab Spring, The Rise of Communitocracy. Now, having said that, you know that here you have prominent editorialists, very important decision makers in Lebanon. So please feel at ease. We won't be long. Take your time. If you want to speak in French, please do. If you prefer the English, we will be listening. And we thank you very, very, very much. Professor Salah.
All right, thank you, Professor Najjar, for holding this event. And I'm actually delighted and honored to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Edward Djerejian to talk about the U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East, especially that we are undergoing an exceptional time in this region of the world, and we are trying to find out what is it exactly the U.S. foreign policy, like His Excellency Najjar just mentioned. Is it a policy or policies that we are experiencing in the region? The region is undergoing great turmoil, unprecedentedly so. In the past 8 years, we have almost experienced the overthrow of 8 presidents or head of states, 7 new constitutions instated in different countries. And you know, the level of violence has gone uncontrolled. Millions of people have lost their lives, their homes, their cities, and Lebanon is being impacted and influenced by all these events. So we're all eager to know the United States' positions toward the many issues in the region. Syria, for instance, what is it the U.S. foreign policy toward Syria now? President Trump has decided to pull out troops. Are we experiencing a new deal in Syria with the Russians or not? What is it that we're having in Iran? Where would the U.S. policy in enforcing the sanctions toward Iran? Where would that be heading? And how is it influencing Lebanon, perhaps, especially that the sanctions are impacting Hezbollah? But very importantly for us to learn with the U.S. policy is where the Trump administration's going with the Arab-Israeli peace. A new deal of the century we're hearing about, given that United States has recognized Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel, also recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights. So we have a lot of issues that influencing and impacting us via U.S. foreign policy, and I guess there is no one better to answer all these questions than Your Excellency. But before, allow me to introduce you. His Excellency Ibrahim Najjar, as the name tells you, is from Armenian origin and part of the Armenian community in the United States. He's the director of the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, one of the leading think tanks in the United States and the world. He served 8 presidents, starting with President John Kennedy to President William Clinton. He served as an ambassador to both Israel and Iran, and Syria.
I wouldn't be here.
Who knows? And received at least 8 distinguished presidential awards during his service to foreign affairs. And very importantly also, His Excellency is the author of a book called Danger and Opportunity, an American Ambassador's Journey through the Middle East. I guess your journey continues, and we would like to hear more about your journeys and your insights about Middle Eastern foreign perspectives.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for this inviting my wife in here to this foundation and this very illustrious group. You said I would be at ease when you invited journalists and decision makers. I don't know how you came to that conclusion, but well, we're delighted to be here. It's true that I've been around for a long time, and there is this saying in the Middle East that I'm so old that I can remember the Dead Sea when I was only sick. So it's been a long period, a long career, and I would like to give my views. My views are my personal views. I'm no longer in the American government. I'm not an official, so I speak only for myself. But I think that the period we're in now in the Middle East, and I said this at the time when I call them the Arab uprisings. They call it the Arab Spring, but I always think when you have spring, you have the fall, you have a winter, you have the seasons, but I think the Arab uprising is a more appropriate term. But what happened in 2011, 2012, which started, as you know, in Tunis, with this young man immolating himself, and putting that spark that spread throughout the Middle East, is a tectonic shift in the political landscape of not only the Arab countries, but also in the broader Middle East. I think you all were watching the television, the Al Jazeera footage of what was happening, but there was one young demonstrator in Tunisia who was holding up a sign in Arabic, kafaya. And that to me represented the whole movement. Enough. But enough of what? Enough of systemic corruption in the regimes, in the Arab world especially, but in the broader Middle East. Enough of the lack of political participation. Enough of not having enough jobs for the youth of these countries. Enough of this stale government of not really responding to the needs of the people, but basically responding to the own political needs of the leadership in each one of these countries. That, to me, represented the whole movement. And I think it is something that, while we know that it was suppressed in many countries, there was the counter-revolution, if you will, that is temporary. Because what started in 2011, 2012 is a spontaneous movement of people. There was no political leadership. There was no political organization. Some people wrongfully say this was a revolution created by the iPhone and social media. No, it wasn't created. It was created for the fundamental issues that exist in these societies in the Middle East. And it was facilitated by social media because the state-controlled communications could not stop the word getting throughout the country and throughout the world. So we saw how that movement rapidly evolved from Tunisia into Egypt and throughout the world. And now today, what we are seeing in Sudan and what we're seeing in Algeria, I believe, is a continuation of what started in 2011, 2012. So it's there, and it's going to continue. And there will be the counter-revolutions, and there'll be then the revolts. But it's a period of turmoil. So how does the United States respond to this? Not very coherently. If you expect me to be able to explain to you that there's a coherent U.S. policy toward the Middle East, I cannot do that. There is none. There is none. You know, in my long experience in diplomacy, the greatest statesmen we had in American diplomacy were those who could deal with the immediate fires that you have to put out in foreign policy, the crises that erupt, and you have to manage them. That's a very necessary aspect of diplomacy. But where America has excelled in this diplomacy is where the leaders we had were able to go from crisis management and conflict management to conflict resolution. In other words, to see beyond the immediate crisis and see what policies should be put in place in the long term to resolve these issues. The height of American diplomacy that we've never been able to replicate again, of course, our circumstances were there, was right after World War II, when we had leaders like President Truman and then Eisenhower and George Marshall and Dean Acheson as the Secretary of State. And the reason I mention that is because there were all these crises they had to put out, but then they put a strategy in place that was historic in world terms, because up to World War II, anytime someone won a war, the general tradition, you suppress your enemy, you humiliate your enemy, you have won. Treaty of Versailles, which the history of the Middle East, you know, the Sykes-Picot and the colonial period that Lebanon is such an important part of, is a demonstration of that. But in World War II, people like Truman and Marshall and Kennan and my mentor, George Paul, basically said, no, we're going to now resurrect Germany, form a Nazi enemy. We're going to resurrect Japan, former imperial Japanese enemy. And we're going to make these two countries the motive force of democratization and economic opportunity. That was an incredible, brilliant foreign policy insight, and it worked. Germany became the central point of the rejuvenation of Europe after World War II. Japan became a democratic economic power. Now that's the ideal. We have had certain imitations of that ideal since, but nothing that strategic. Today, we are putting out fires. We are looking at immediate crises and putting out fires. And where there are conflicts to be resolved, you mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian one, which is really critical. There is the deal of the century that nobody knows except a very small group of people know what it means. And we should see perhaps in June what that plan is. But I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of that plan because I think if it is not based on the fundamental principles of land for peace, it is not going to work. My own bias is that Palestinian self-determination still remains a very important force, political idea in the region. That if the Palestinians continue to be deprived of their self-determination, that either the status quo will continue between Israel and the Palestinians, which is a dangerous status quo. Because what that means is that the Israelis can easily continue occupying the Palestinian territories. They can easily continue to build up the Israeli economy, which is thriving. And they can live in a bubble. But that bubble is an unstable bubble, because if you see what's happening on the southern border with Israel, with Hamas, and the recurrent conflicts, and Gaza really is a humanitarian catastrophe. And then if you look at the northern border, which is Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Israel, and always the possibility of a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, with Iran looming very much in the background. So, to me, this is very unstable. I was in Israel about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and there was a briefing by the military intelligence. It was a public briefing. It was at one of their think tanks. And I was really struck by the concern that military intelligence had in Israel over a future conflict on the northern border with Hezbollah. Because their assessment is that Hezbollah has gained a great deal of training in Syria, in the Syrian civil war, that they've lost people, but at the same time, their warriors, their militias have gained a lot of on-the-ground military experience. And their missile inventory has increased to approximately 130,000 missiles, and with more precision, because you remember the first war, the missiles went into northern Israel. Now they have the capability of going much further south. So this is a preoccupation, obviously, for the Israeli leadership, but it's there. My assessment now is neither Hassan Nasrallah nor the Israelis want a war for their own reasons. But, again, in my long experience in the Middle East, when there are vacuums and there's no progress being made toward settlements, political settlements, bad things can happen. Because the Middle East is so unstable. So that's probably the most realistic option, is the continuation of the status quo between Israel and Palestine, Israel in the north, Israel in the south. The Trump plan, again, we have to wait and see. I just don't want to speculate in the air because we don't know what it is. But I'm very skeptical that they're going to opt for economic peace, security peace, and some territorial adjustments. But if they do not have what we created under Bush 41 and Secretary Baker at the Madrid Peace Conference. Remember, the Madrid Peace Conference was one of the greatest achievements in the history of Arab-Israeli conflict resolution, because it was the first time we were able to get Israel to sit at the same table with all its immediate Arab neighbors and the other Arabs, the Gulf Arabs, the other Arabs of the Maghreb, for direct face-to-face negotiations. I was ambassador to Damascus at the time, and Hafiz al-Assad, when I got there in 1988, he refused to even say the word Israel. He would say the Zionist entity. He wouldn't use the word Israel. By the time we got finished with our tutoring, he was not only talking about Israel, but we were educating him on the difference between Likud and Meretz and the Labour Party and all this stuff. He was very interested in that. But we finally got him to agree to go to face-to-face direct negotiations with Israel. And the reason he didn't want to do that is he felt that Israel was the superior political military power, and that to go face-to-face, he needed a buffer. The Arabs needed a buffer, the United Nations. The Israelis don't trust the United Nations. So that was the task we had in our diplomacy, was to get the Arab side to agree to something they had not agreed to before. And we succeeded. But I'll remember the letter that I received from, to convey to President Bush from Hafiz al-Assad. It was an amazing letter, just about 2.5 pages, agreeing to direct negotiations. I couldn't believe it when I was reading it. And the only clause, it was the only clause in the last paragraph: if this effort fails, and I am putting my trust in you, the President of the United States. That's the key in a lot of these things, is the personal relationships between leaders. Bush 41 was able to convey an element of trust to a very cunning Arab leader. I mean, those of you who know Hafiz al-Assad, you know the negotiations go on for hours and hours. We used to call it bladder diplomacy, because you couldn't get up and go to the bathroom. He would never get up and go to the bathroom. And when I told Secretary Baker his first meeting with Hafiz al-Assad, I said, be prepared. He's going to serve a lot of lemonade, and the room is going to be hot, and he's not going to get up. And he says, how does he do it? I said, I think he has tubes in his chair. I don't know how he does it, but I think he must have tubes in his chair, because, you know, but he said, well, and then Baker said, you know, well, I am the Secretary of State of the free world. If Assad doesn't get up, I'm not going to get up. And so we would go through these brutal meetings. I mean, you know, and then once despite the advice, I couldn't stand it anymore. So I looked at Farouk Shara and I said, I have to call my embassy. Of course, I didn't have to call my embassy. And Shara goes like this. I left the room because Assad started going into, which is usually 9 minutes long, why Sykes-Picot is the cause of all the ills of the contemporary Middle East. It's the colonialists, the French, the British, and all that. So I came back and I thought I was being very clever. When we were out waving Secretary Baker's plane away, of course it's a ridiculous custom, because no one in the plane is looking out. And we're sort of waving like this, and Farouk Shara turns to me and he says, you know, Ed, you didn't fool anyone. When you left the room, Baker told President Assad that you could not hold your water. But I give you that anecdote. I mean, it was just a question of the hours we spent to get him to the point. It took leadership, you see, it took leadership. And those personal relationships are really critical. So Madrid is still in place, and Madrid did lead, despite its failure, and we don't have enough time, I could go into the reasons why we didn't succeed, but we had our elections. And Bush lost those elections, and we lost momentum. Clinton started, but he started too late, and we had lost momentum. Again, when you lose time in the Middle East, the opportunities, they dissipate. But Madrid did lead to the second Israeli treaty with a neighboring state, with Jordan. And King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin in 1994 signed the second thing. So those are, Jimmy Carter was very effective in the peace between Israel. So we have some successes, but we have a lot of failures. And these failures, for many reasons. Right now, I am very skeptical that a plan can be put on the table that would really meet the basic needs of both the Palestinians and the Israelis. And as you all know here, Lebanese politics is so complex and very difficult to understand, and you have to be Lebanese or Armenian to understand. I've represented Burj Hamud all my life. But
so you do understand.
No, but right now, if it is not based on what we put in Madrid, you know, in Madrid we had dual tracks. We had the multilateral track and we had the bilateral. The bilateral track was the important thing, resolving the issues between Israel and Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Israel, Jordan. The multilateral track dealt with economic development, regional security arrangements, environmental issues, as you well know. If you switch and make the multilateral track the primary track, it's not going to work. Because this is a political conflict. And you have to address the political issues, Jerusalem, the refugees, the borders, the settlements. There are plans in place. We've been negotiating this for years. There is a way. I'm still convinced that there is a way to resolve all these issues. Now, in the larger picture, I think the Arab uprisings and the turmoil in the whole region, the rise of these extremist radical groups, be it Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, these extremist groups represent the lack of conflict resolution, and as I'm talking about, resolving conflicts, and also represent the frustrations of the people in these countries, which are radicalized. If you simply, I don't have to tell you, if you have young people without jobs, without a future, they are prone to the siren call of either a religious extremist or a secular extremist. It's easy to recruit them because there's no hope. So fundamentally, to have an effective counterterrorism policy, it has to necessarily be lethal. You have to use military force, intelligence, you have to get at the bad guys. But in the longer term, you have to resolve the root causes of why extremism exists. So this, I feel that we do not have enough wisdom, but we've identified this in past administrations, and we've carried on. But I gave a speech in 1992 when I was Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East under Bush 41, and later Clinton also, but under Bush 41, the Meridian House speech in which, you remember in 1992 there were the Algerian elections and the Islamic Salvation Front looked like it was going to come to power. So we were disturbed by that, but not as disturbed as the French were, but we were disturbed by that. But in his speech, which was authorized by Secretary Baker and the administration, we had to say something about American policy toward the Middle East after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the demise of the Soviet Union, because the chessboard had changed, especially in the Middle East. Now, frankly, when we were dealing with Middle East matters during the Cold War, it was, is this country with us or is it with the Soviet Union? Syria was with the Soviet Union, Lebanon was with us, Jordan was with us, the Gulf states were with us, Egypt went back and forth, but fundamentally it was a superpower chessboard. That disappeared overnight. So this speech basically addressed that issue, that now we have to, what is the next ism after communism that the United States has to face in the Middle East? And so the conclusion was the next ism that we're going to face in the Middle East is extremism or terrorism of either a secular or a religious cloak. This is 1992. 1 year later was the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. And then, of course, 9/11 many years later. And so we had to basically adopt policies that were addressing what the real problem. And we also said in that speech to our friends in the Middle East, especially the Gulf Arab states, that the real threat, we can deal with external threats as we did with Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. But the real threat to these countries is from within, for the reasons I explained: socioeconomic issues, political issues, the inability of the countries to respond to the basic needs of their people, and their populations becoming radicalized and extremism taking over. And I use one phrase: what good is the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf? We had the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf since 1949 to protect the free flow of oil through the Straits of Hormuz. We have military installations, as you know, throughout the region. But I said, what good are these military installations to our friends in the region if the threat is from within? Is the United States military going to go into these countries and restore regimes? No, no, no.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
2019, Trumpism.
Exactly. Trump, exactly. 2019 Trump is. But we say, you know, you can't parachute in a Jeffersonian model diplomacy into the San Francisco. You can't do that. But there are ways of influencing these countries. For example, we noted in that talk that Saudi Arabia had a Majlis al-Shura. We should be encouraging the King of Saudi Arabia to expand that Majlis and one day make it elected, which they've done, and then include women. And King Abdullah actually started doing that. But the point was, don't do what George W. Bush did in 2003, invade Iraq and overthrow an Arab regime with the illusion that we're going to build democracy through the use of military force and American power. It didn't work. It was one of the causes of the creation of ISIS and destabilization in the region. Also, the war in Iraq of 2003, which I consider to be one of the major in American foreign policy, opened the door for Iran to move west into the Arab world. Because if you think about it, when we went into Iraq in 2003, the general is nodding his head, I'm glad to see that, we destroyed the fourth largest army in the world, Iraq's army. And we opened up Iraq for Iran to move in and start west through Syria with its base here its instrument here in Lebanon, in Hezbollah. And so it's not a territorial access. A lot of people think, oh, Iran has a territory. No, no. And I don't even believe it's a Shiite access. Yeah, I don't buy into the Shiite-Sunni axis. The Shiites only represent 15% of the Muslim world. The Sunnis represent, if I'm not mistaken, at least 85%. So it's not that there's going to be a Shiite empire. But the Iranians are so clever because what they do it is with nufuz, with influence. Just like they have a dual government in Iran, the Ayatollahs and the parliamentary government, they establish in Iraq, they have the popular militias, they have their people in place who support them. So it's like a parallel government. They're going to try to do the same thing in Syria. And in Lebanon, you have it. So, but look how astute that policy is. That's a very clever policy. Because it's not guns on the ground so much, although I know Hezbollah has guns. But it's basically a access of influence that is very sophisticated. And so, how do we deal with this? You see, now, I did support Obama's JCPOA, the nuclear deal, because we did an analysis with others that showed that that deal was just a nuclear non-proliferation deal. It wasn't a deal to resolve all our problems with Iran, which is why it's criticized now. Why did you go into a deal with Iran when it is doing this in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen? Why? Well, no. It was a deal to contain Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, because the Obama administration thought that if Iran went nuclear, the Saudis would go nuclear, the other Arab countries would go nuclear, and we would have nuclear proliferation, which would be extremely dangerous for the region. So I supported the deal because it gave us 10 to 15 years of intrusive IAEA inspections of Iran's nuclear operations. At the time, Iran could have gone nuclear weapons in a matter of months. But now, it can't. There's more time. It bought time. It has flaws. And one of the flaws is that the ballistic missiles were not addressed. That's one flaw. That's one flaw. That I agree. That's one flaw. But, having said that, it's very important, I think, that in diplomacy, as Baker has said often, you don't negotiate peace with your friends, you negotiate peace with your enemies. So I think it's very important that we have a strategic dialogue with our adversaries and a real substantive dialogue. And I'm not only talking about it in the Middle East, obviously with countries like Iran, with countries like China, with countries like, I mean, Trump has gone into a strategic dialogue with Kim Jong-un. Why can't it be done elsewhere? You see? So, in toto, I think that we need to have a coherent policy that addresses the long-term problems in the region without having any illusions. And I think the United States can influence events. It still remains the preeminent power, not as much as before, that's for sure, but still the preeminent power. But we can influence events on the margins in an intelligent way by really promoting these socio-economic political processes in these countries to get at the root problem, and where possible, resolving conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Wow, I guess you clarified a lot of issues, but you brought to our mind a lot more questions to ask. But we will be holding our water to answer, to get all the answers. I mean, in my mind already, whether we can have another Madrid conference, and if we are to extend a new Madrid conference, who will be sitting on the table? Will we be having our adversaries, like you mentioned? Will there be Nasrallah sitting on a table along in front of Israel? Will Bashar al-Assad be sitting there? I mean, things to
I sat on the table. I was there.
You were there,
Ultimately.
that's right. Yes, I did.
right. So I guess
Go through good days.
we'll take questions, and we'll take 2-3 questions and we'll have answers.
حسب الوزراء بالأول يمكن.
We'll go on around like this. So give it.
Your Excellency, is it,
Would you introduce yourself, please?
I am Isa Bey from Lorraine.
Mashur.
أشهر النار على علم.
We started our careers in the same year, 1965. L'Oréal Le Jour, 1965. I was a young American diplomat assigned to our embassy in Beirut to study Arabic.
And
أنا درست العربي هون في بيت.
I added that you made it better than me.
No.
Learning Arabic.
No.
Is it reasonable to hope and expect that Trump's decisions about Jerusalem, Golan, and expectedly the West Bank are not irreversible, that someday we can hope that the next administration will back off? Is it reasonable to expect such?
Reversible.
Well, when America makes a foreign policy decision like the ones you mentioned, it's important because it has its weight. But they're basically unilateral decisions made by the United States that are not necessarily agreed upon by many other countries. So yes, the U.S.-Israeli relationship is so strong that when the American president decides to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, that has a great impact, as does a declaration that the United States supports Israel's extension of sovereignty over the Golan Heights. But these decisions are not approved by virtually the great majority of other countries. So my answer to you is that these things eventually are reversible. They are reversible. But they have a meaningful impact now, and you don't know what will happen if, for example, if Trump gets another term. You know, and you know, Trump's popular, the polls, if you can trust polls, is that right now, if there were elections in the United States, it's more probable that he'd be reelected. Because he has appealed to a very strong, small but hard base that supports him very strongly. And the Democrats have so many presidential candidates now that, you know, that weakens. They have to come up with one candidate that can really win an election and challenge Trump. So the thing is that I don't want to make light of this, but just answer your question. Reversible, perhaps, but it all depends on the next administration.
I have two questions.
The second ones are usually the most dangerous.
One is that, is there a difference in American policy, US policy, between declared goals of certain moves and real goals? For example, the declared goal for going into Iraq in 2003 was in order to eliminate the threat of weapon of mass destruction,
Yes.
and in order to install a democratic government. Of course, there was not really any significant evidence of weapons of mass destruction then, because it wasn't found. So the Americans didn't really have had before the invasion any evidence. But now what happened afterwards is that, of course, no democratic government was installed, and the country went into chaos, and Iran was invited. Now, is this outcome against the interests of the United States? Or could we imagine that this was really the real purpose of the invasion? The real purpose of the invasion in the sense that, one strong Arab country has been destroyed, almost, and a strong Lebanese, a strong Arab army was dissolved, which was really a decision that was surprising then and at any time. And yes, Iran was allowed to come in, it's true.
What's the question, please? There are other people who want to ask questions.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Who wants my question? I started with the question. I started off with the question that, is there a difference between real purposes and declared purposes? Could it be that the American goals were to reach this situation, which is also very, very fine for Israel, and incidentally intensifying Shia-Sunni Shia-Sunni antagonism is not against Israel's interest?
Well, I think the complicated question you're asking, but fundamentally, I think the stated goals that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction proved to be basics. He had chemical, biological capabilities, but not nuclear. And nothing, as you said, was found. But the real goal, so the stated goal was Saddam Hussein's a threat, he's a brutal dictator, he has weapons of mass destruction, we're going to invade Iraq and change the situation and help stabilize the Middle East. But that was the stated goal. But the real goal of the people who were in positions of foreign policy formulation at the time were the neocons, the so-called neocons. And they had this ideological precept that dates way before the Bush administration, that it would be in the interests of the United States and Israel that the countries of the Arab world become democratic, because if Israel is surrounded by democracies, that would be more sure than being surrounded by dictatorships.
Or chaos.
No, I know, but this was it. But you see, their real goal was regime change. And through regime change to install a democratic Iraqi government. That was their real ideological goal. I remember when I was ambassador to Israel, I had one of many conversations with Prime Minister Rabin, who was really a statesman. Rabin's death, his assassination, set back the Arab-Israeli peace process in a critical way. But he told me, he said, you know, Ed, if Israel had to wait for all its Arab neighbors to become truly democratic, we'd be waiting 1,000 years. This is from Yitzhak Rabin. Now, the point of the matter is that here's the man in the neighborhood, and yet these policymakers in Washington had the illusion that through the use of US military might, we can install democracies in the Middle East. I don't want to say that this is 20/20 hindsight, especially being in a think tank now. We published a report in January 2003, 2 months before the invasion, with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Baker Institute. Very short report, and two of our major recommendations were, if we go to war in Iraq, we were against going, but if we do go, the aftermath of the war is critical. Recommendation number one, do not dismantle the Iraqi military. Get rid of the top officers close to Saddam Hussein, but keep the military in place, or else the United States is going to have to be responsible for the national security of Iraq. Recommendation number two, do not dismantle the Ba'ath Party, because these are your technicians, your civil administrations, and I had come from a country, I had served in Syria, that's another Ba'athist, but I realized that if you destroy the party, you're destroying your administrators. Because if we dismantle and destroy the Ba'ath Party, then we are going to have to take that role. And how can we? They ignored both of these recommendations completely. Now, this is before we went in. So the point I'm making is that there was a base of knowledge within the State Department, within the American government, and outside in certain think tanks that were not listened to. So the decision-making was made by these people, and it was faulty.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador, for your contribution. Well, in order to counter communism and USSR at one point, the US administration, I do remember Brzezinski specifically, did support the Islamism of Taliban in Afghanistan, the religious nationalism in East Europe, and went into an arms race that led to what we know, the fall of the USSR. Later, in order to counter the Islamism, the jihadism, we thought that maybe the military could do that, or the liberals, too weak, or, quote unquote, the moderate Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood did fail in Egypt. The liberals are too weak. Are we back to the military? Sisi, Haftar, Sudan, Assad, etc., or else? That's
well,
my question.
unfortunately, the counter-revolution, maybe that's too strong a term, has put the military back in place in various countries, and Haftar now is one new element in that. What we just saw what happened in Sudan, and what's interesting in Sudan is that the people are not buying off on just the change of Bashir. They're saying we want to get rid of the deep state. Algeria, the same thing. They're saying it's not just Bouteflika, but we want to get rid of the deep state, which is the marriage between the military and the elite that really rule the country. The people are wise. They see through this corruption of power and money, and they, kafaya, enough. So we'll have to see how this evolves in all of these countries. Sisi, the Muslim Brotherhood made a terrible error in Egypt. But the major error is that they came to office on the ballot box. And then once in office, they did not play the democratic game. They tried to change the constitution, and they gave the military an opening to come in and throw them out. In this Meridian House speech, there's a clause that made a lot of headlines in the Middle East at the time. I said, while the United States, because I was addressing political Islam, and I said, while the United States is for the ladies in the room, I used the term person. While the United States is for one person, one vote, the United States is not for one person, one vote, one time. And this was a message to Algeria, in what was happening in Algeria, that, okay, the Islamist Salvation Front can come to power, but once in power, will it respect the rules of the game? And if the next time the vote goes against them, will they leave peacefully? Morsi, and that in the Arab world was one man, one vote, one time. That, Morsi miscalculated. He opened the door for the military to come in, and now Sisi is monopolizing his power now. Now I think that he can, 2030 and beyond, you know. So,
At least.
so basically, to answer your question, it's really how the momentum will evolve. Sudan and Algeria now are two very interesting problems. Tunisia was a little element of hope. With Rashid Ghannouchi, you had an Islamist, he's a very intelligent man. I was in a letter conversation with him when I was Assistant Secretary of State. And I realized that this man's very intelligent. But he played the democratic game, and when they lost, they left peacefully, you see. But that's just a little glimmer of hope. So I think right now the tendency is toward strongman rule. The model is authoritarian stability. That is what they say. Yes, authoritarian stability is what the formula is. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, you had a very distinguished career, but the ship of state is very heavy to move. I wanted to ask you sort of a semi-personal question, which is, in your distinguished career, do you think there was a moment where you could have done something that you didn't and now you regret it?
Yes.
Something that would have changed something in the Middle East?
Well, we should have, yes. You want me to do a confession in front of my wife? Who's my biggest critic? But one of the, in politics and policy, there's the phenomenon of unintended consequences. You do something for a reason that's very important at the time, but then when you look ahead, you get unintended consequences. When we opposed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and we used the Mujahideen, we helped create the Mujahideen to counter the Soviet military occupation of Afghanistan. We went one step further. If I could change anything, which is an illusion because one man certainly at my level can't, but if I could change anything, I would have never subcontracted our policy in Afghanistan to the Saudis and the Pakistanis. Because remember what we did, because we went to war in Iraq. 9/11 was 2001. 2 short years later, the invasion of Iraq. American priorities immediately changed, and we subcontracted out to the Saudis and the Pakistanis, who gave their aid to the Mujahideen. The madrasas, the Islamic radicalism that was perpetuated by empowering this trend, had long-term consequences that we never foresaw.
But that wasn't you. Your responsibilities were much earlier.
When?
In 2011, you were no longer in government.
No, this 2001.
Yeah, you were not in government then.
No, 2001, no.
Your mistake goes back, way back.
Oh, my mistake goes way back before that.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, that's true. We helped the Mujahideen much earlier than that.
Thank you for, of course, this brilliant presentation. Can we know where are we going in the Middle East today? As your perspective, how do you think we should go out from what we are living today? It's chaos, it's a disaster. How can the Middle East go out of all this?
Well, I think if the Middle East is in a very dangerous and unstable situation now. And the fundamental forces that I mentioned, the socioeconomic especially, and the political stalemate, the stale political situation in almost every country. Because there has to be structural socioeconomic reforms, real reforms. There has to be, forget about eliminating, but real limits on corruption and systemic corruption. If these factors are not addressed in a realistic manner, I am very pessimistic about the future of the Middle East.
So Lebanon is a hopeless case.
No, I did not say that. I did not say that.
Well, first I have to follow up the question of Dr. Mallat. Was there any other option in Afghanistan?
No, we had to oppose the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And my wife is right. My policy-making role there, we were at the embassy in Moscow at the time when they invaded and all that, and we countered the invasion, and we countered it with the aid of whoever we could get. That's true. But then the unintended consequences of that much later were what I said. There was no, what I'm saying is that we should not have been, our invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was a just war because Al-Qaeda attacked us in New York and Pennsylvania and Washington. They attacked our homeland. The first attack on the American homeland since the British did in 1814. It was a major event for Americans. So the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001 to overthrow the Taliban and to eliminate the safe haven they were giving to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden was a just war. What I'm saying is that we should have stayed the course in Afghanistan and not get diverted by Iraq. Had we stayed the course in Afghanistan, I think Afghanistan would be more stable today than it was because that's what we subcontracted out to others. That's my...
And a final question, very small. Now, regarding the geopolitical situation in the world, how do you assess the focus of the United States on the Middle East if you compare it to Southeast Asia or Central Europe or the Baltics or elsewhere?
You know, during the Obama administration, President Obama made this famous statement, the pivot to Asia. We're going to pivot our policy toward Asia because China is so important, Japan, our interests in Asia are so important that the Middle East cannot preoccupy all of our attention as it has in the past, so much of it. I think what you see under Trump, the one area where I agree with Trump is he is against nation building, this nation building by the United States. In other words, that the United States try to do what we tried to do in Iraq through political, military, economic, that we change these systems in these countries. I think he's right in that because even the United States, despite our power, we are not capable of nation building. I'll never forget when we were, the Iraq study group, we were visiting Baghdad, and this very charismatic American general, three-star general, was the George General, he was briefing the study group, which is a very consequential group. It was Susan Day O'Connor, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and a lot of people on the court, on that commission that were important. And he said, your military, your American military, we can clear, in other words, we can win the battle. We can hold the ground and maintain military stability in Iraq, but we cannot build. And your military is being asked to clear and hold and build. And then he said something that never left my mind. He said, the United States military is picking up the trash in downtown Baghdad. That's a bridge too far. You don't go into these countries and then you become responsible for sanitation, electricity, administration. So with Trump, I agree, nation building is a bridge too far, even for the United States. We have to get away. We can influence events on the margins with economic, social, USAID assistance, NGOs. There are things we can do on the margins, but we should not have the illusion of power and the arrogance of power to say that we can go into a country and try to change it.
That's the limit of superpower.
There's the limit, exactly.
But Venezuela, in the case of Venezuela, it's national.
Yeah, well, Venezuela now, so far I haven't seen an indication that we're going to take military action. I don't think, well, I don't know, I'm not in the administration, but it's a great deal of political pressure for regime change.
Your Excellency, it's about Syria. I believe everybody is interested about Syria. You said that you are not believing in the Shia croissant and something like that, but you are saying in Syria something different. Syria, as we know, is over, I believe so. So, what do you think that Russia and Iran now are splitting things in Syria strategically? So, how do you see Syria going on after all that? And Israel, of course, after the Golan Heights and Turkey and something like that.
You know, I never, I'll be very honest with you, when we were in Damascus until 1991, if anyone had told me that Syria is going to devolve into a brutal civil war, this humanitarian crisis, I would have said no, that's not going to happen to Syria. The worst has happened to Syria. It's a humanitarian disaster. The dislocation of, the internal dislocation alone of 6 million people, plus the exodus of refugees. You're hosting 1.4 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Jordan, Turkey is hosting. And what happened in Syria has had an impact not only in the Middle East, but throughout the world. And I say that because I asked the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, a colleague of mine, Lionel Barber, I said, did the Syrian civil war have any influence on Brexit? He said, absolutely. He said, absolutely, because the image of all these refugees flowing into Europe, and you know, England is going to maintain its independence. I never, you know, to me, he said absolutely Brexit had the Syrian crisis. The point there is what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. It has an impact on the region. So when I mentioned the Shiite axis, don't get me wrong, I said there is from Tehran a influence that in political, economic terms that, and in religious terms also, but that throughout the west toward Lebanon and in Yemen, but it's not a territorial access. You see, some people make the mistake, they think that Iran is establishing a territorial bridge. There's no territorial bridge. Yes,
it's not sectarian necessarily.
And it's not sectarian. We have a very good scholar at the Baker Institute, Mohammad Ayatollah Tabar. He's an Iranian scholar. He just wrote a book on the nexus between politics and religion in Iran. I recommend it. It's serious. And he makes the case that the Ayatollahs use religion for political purposes. They will shift. They'll use religion for different political purposes. They're survivors. Their main purpose is regime security. So if you understand that, then you could understand what their politics are. I think the greatest influence in Syria from the outside is Iranian today. Russia has influence, obviously. Putin has played a very weak hand very skillfully, because Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. Its economy is in turmoil. It's demographically challenged, not creating enough babies. You know, they're not. But Putin is so clever in the way he manipulates his foreign policy that they have influence. They have the base in Tartus and the military presence, and he's a broker. He's a political broker. Now, Trump, because he's against nation building, wants to get our troops out of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The military and the diplomatic side of the house, I've convinced him for the moment not to do anything precipitous. Keep the little number of troops we have in Syria with the hope of stabilizing the situation against ISIS, but also, if ever there are political transition talks again on the future of Syria, that the United States could have some cards to play at the table. So you know the Geneva process, which is now there's the Astana process, and there's all these different processes in place, but fundamentally, what the future of Syria is going to depend upon political transition. I think the bloodshed in Syria has been so intense that there has to be a political transition of some sort. And if that doesn't happen, the country is going to remain divided. Right now, Bashar al-Assad has, consolidated his power over certain parts of Syria, and but the Kurdish question remains very acute. And in Idlib, you have 3-odd million, people that the question mark is what's going to happen there. And Syria has become really very much influenced by outside powers, be it Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And now you have the Gulf countries that, so it's a big question mark. But I think the important thing is to go through a political transition, that get people around the table and see if there can be a political transition that all can agree upon.
Excellency, many Lebanese like to believe that Lebanon is a necessity for the West, and including the United States.
A necessity for the West?
Yes, that it's a Western vital interest, Lebanon.
Lebanese point of view.
At one point,
I agree with you.
I didn't say that.
Good. This is the point.
At one point, Bob Oakley told me, you Lebanese think you are the center of the world. But I would like to pose a question here. How much do you think the West generally, and specifically the United States, would really work to keep Lebanon as is for as long as possible?
I think the attitude in Washington, and I cannot speak for the administration, but the attitude in Washington is that Lebanon has to get its act together. You really have to start facing your problems, be it electricity, picking up the garbage, attacking the issues of corruption. You have to get your act together. Only you can do it. No one can help you do that from the outside. Really, this is the problem. You have to do that. You, the Lebanese, have to take your destiny into your own hands. You have been the victims of one of the worst civil wars in history, which is a great tragedy. But fundamentally, I think that, the Lebanon that I knew when I was a young diplomat here is like a dream. It's like a dream. I mean, obviously there were problems, but the Lebanon that I knew was a functioning multi-confessional state. And our very good friend Hassan Twaini once told me, he said, Ed, if Lebanon cannot succeed as a multi-confessional society in the Arab world, no one else can. I never forgot that. And that's why if you say Lebanon is a necessity, in those terms I say yes. If you can restore your model as a parliamentary system, which is dealing with its critical issues, economic, social, dealing with your critical issues, and yet sharing political power amongst these groups, that would be obviously welcome. Or perhaps the system itself is not working, and that's another thing that you have to address. Is the confessional system able to work as it's structured now, or should it be in some ways reformed? I'm just speaking personally now, but as I'm a friend of Lebanon. I think Lebanon, to me, represented, you like some of the great countries in the Middle East, you go back to the Phoenician times. You have a long cultural, historic history. Egypt has a deep history. Iran has a deep history. Syria, Lebanon, I mean, you have deep history, you have something of value that you have to preserve. But if you don't attack your immediate problems, you're not doomed, it's not going to work. It's not going to work.
Your Excellency, just small question. Does Bashar Assad is a necessity for Israel?
Is Bashar al-Assad a necessity for Israel?
They play tango.
Boy, that's quite a question. I don't know. Actually, I don't have an answer to that because I simply don't know. But I think Israel would.
There's no alternative.
I think Israel could tolerate whatever alternatives came up, and if they were adversarial, they would deal with it. If they were more friendly, they would deal with it. But no, I don't think anyone is indispensable.
Moindre mal. A lesser evil.
Yes, perhaps.
Or maybe I was for Bashar.
Yes.
Can we say it's due to previous experience in other countries, in other Arab countries, with chaos like it happened in Iraq? Do you think that it is for this reason that the Ba'ath is maintained in Syria because of a structure of a country or secular tendency? Because people are quite upset with extremism. Do you think that it is one of the reasons, after 10 years of war and destruction, to remain with the Ba'ath in Syria?
Well, it provides a civil administration in the country,
Yes.
which is a source of organization and stability. But the question for Syria is that has the civil war so alienated various groups that system no longer can provide that security? That's the big question, because what Syria's gone through is a nightmare. But yes, I mean there is a system that provides administration, but the deeper problem is the ability of the various groups in Syria now to coexist and go into a political transition. Yes, sir.
USA is putting a huge pressure on Iran through these economic sanctions.
Yeah.
Do you think this will bring Iran to the table, or it will bring it to general war or local wars in Lebanon with Israel?
Well, I think the sanctions against Iran, which, as you've read in the newspapers today, are intensifying and increasing, is really taking a toll on the Iranian economy, and it's having an impact. And what that will result in terms of Iran's political behavior is a big question mark, because they have gotten used to working under sanctions and blockades for a long time. And they may try to just play for time. But the sanctions are having an impact financially. That's true. But I don't think it's going to lead, I don't think it's necessarily going to lead to a war. I mean, right now, I don't think anyone is interested on either side for a war.
Good question.
I have a question. I have a question, and I would like to, at the same time, thank Mr. George and Miriam Antaki for having given us the opportunity to welcome you.
Thank you very much.
And they have been really very friendly, and I'm grateful for their support. If you don't mind, Your Excellency, when we finish now, we may perhaps take a picture all together, if you don't mind.
No, it'll be fine.
And because everybody is anxious to see a picture with you, to see himself in the picture with you. And believe me, it was a very, very, very interesting talk, and you have confirmed many of our ideas, and we're looking forward to to welcome you once more, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
And perhaps Mr. Ahmed Salam will have to put the final word.
Great. I mean, thank you so much. Really insightful analysis that brought from long experience in foreign affairs, U.S. foreign policy in the region. I think we are definitely going into an exceptional time. A lot of issues to reckon with. But we remain hopeful. You gave us some good hopes that perhaps what we are going through are Arab uprisings rather than spring, winter, and so forth. There are many things to pay attention to, like nation building and so forth. So we truly appreciate your insight. We look forward to continue listening to your contributions and to international affairs as we all learn from. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
First step.
Very good, Yeah, no.